Hola, bienvenidos a todos y a todas a la Cumbre Virtual de Geometría Sagrada, la estructura de la realidad. Mi nombre es Juan Pablo Uribe, organizador de esta cumbre, y estoy muy feliz, muy honrado y de verdad eso es muy agradable presentarles al expositor que tenemos hoy día. Dan Winter es conocido como uno de los más dinámicos pensadores de nuestro tiempo. Académico internacionalmente respetado, físico, autor, psicofisiólogo, animador en computación, inventor y una de las máximas autoridades en geometría sagrada y en la naturaleza científica de la conciencia. Por medio de la ciencia, la mitología y la cultura popular, Dan está constantemente formulando ideas vanguardistas acerca de la conectividad profunda de todas las cosas y cómo la profunda naturaleza de nuestra unidad puede ser alcanzada a través de la geometría sagrada, la arquitectura, el arte, las matemáticas, la biología, las computadoras, la electrónica y la mitología. Su teoría se ha convertido en la base de descubrimientos extraordinarios en Estados Unidos. Autor de libros como Gran Atractor de Implosión y Alfabeto del Corazón de la Tierra. Muy bienvenido, Dan. Muchas gracias por estar presente aquí con todos nuestros amigos hispanohablantes.
Welcome, Dan. Thank you so much for being here and joining us with all our Spanish speaking friends.
I'm delighted to be with you and delighted to reach our friends in South America again. It's been too long and I'm just happy to share, and I love the smile on your faces, and let's do it.
Super. Bueno, para entrar, siempre hago esta pregunta a los ponentes de esta cumbre. ¿Qué es para ti la geometría sagrada y cómo llegó esta información en tu vida?
So to begin, I always make this question to everyone in the summit. What is sacred geometry to you, and how do you get to this information?
You know, sacred geometry originally is thought of in traditional terms like ancient architecture and symbolism and religion. But the more we've studied it over the years, we come to realize sacred geometry is ultimately simply an introduction to the most important part of wave mechanics, which is how waves converge in a way to make them sustainable, to make them sacred. So if we understood what sacred was among waves, which is simply whatever creates sustainability, literally the kind of immortality among waves, which we now know is implosion and fractality. So sacred geometry, although we were teaching it for years as a kind of poetic science, ultimately is an introduction to a very serious physics. And that physics has to do with what's called fractality, or self-similarity, like a rose. So when we understand how waves converge like a rose, like a fractal, we're getting to the heart of sacred geometry, which is what makes them centripetal. And remember, whenever we talk about geometry, we're talking about waves. And whenever we talk about waves, we're talking about charge waves, electrical waves. So ultimately, what we're studying is how the geometry of waves of charge and what causes them to converge in a way that makes them implode, which is to say become centripetal. And we use a word called negentropic, self-organizing, which we will get in this conversation eventually, yes. So I got enthused because I realized that this was an introduction to the sacred, which is not only ancient and traditional, but literally cutting edge physics too.
Y esa manera de observar la naturaleza de la onda como una, podríamos decir, una estructura fundamental de autosustentabilidad del universo. ¿Cómo llegó a ti? ¿Cómo fue el acercamiento a esa concepción? ¿Fue por vía, podríamos decir, inductiva o fue por una vía más emocional? ¿Qué ocurrió? ¿Por una meditación, por un acercamiento de experiencia?
So this way of observing or understanding the nature of the wave as a structure that is auto-sustained or auto-sustains the universe, how did this information get to you? Was it through perhaps emotion or a meditative state, or was it more in terms of a deductive or inductive process?
Mhm. Well, that's the right and beautiful question, actually. You know, I studied electrical engineering, and then I studied psychophysiology. And studying psychophysics and polygraphs and the physics of emotion, of course, I was circling around the important question in graduate school at University of Detroit, psychophysiology. However, and actually I was a systems analyst after that, but really after I was a systems analyst at IBM, I went to the Gurdjieff School, studied sacred gymnastic, and began to have intense, and I do mean intense, Kundalini and bliss experiences, actually.
Mm.
And in the process of experience, intense Kundalini and bliss, Gurdjieff sacred gymnastic, and then I was kind of adopted by Ben Bentoff, who wrote the book on Kundalini. So not only had I studied psychophysiology, and my graduate professor in psychophysiology invented the term biofeedback to help with acts. So suddenly I began to feel this intense centripetal charge in the center of your spine. It feels like lightning. And you know, when you study people who have lightning experiences, near-death experiences, Tesla's lightning experience was a turning point for insight for his life. So I began to feel what compression was. That it's that simple. And when you feel that implosive compression and you feel your aura get really, really big, it's, you know, it's powerful, exciting, and it can be life-threatening. And there's all kinds of hygiene issues. Point being, however, that when you feel intense bliss and you begin to realize that that centripetal force you're feeling during Kundalini has psychokinetic meaning, obviously it made me want to think about the physics. And the physics ultimately, I think, is quite simple. When the waves converge in such a way that that implosive convergence becomes critically centripetal, the waves begin to self-organize, which is to say, the only waves that can pass through that implosive center are those that are sorted perfectly into phase. And ultimately, that sorting process becomes self-sorting. And there's a term for that in physics. It's called negentropy. Entropy means moving disorderly. So negentropy means self-organizing or moving toward order. And so what happens is that that is the beginning of a deep thinking about the physics of what self-organizing is. And from there, I had friends who had been studying the measurements of negentropy as it was first discovered in physics. There was a phase conjugate optics physicist named Bob Zawada in Buffalo. And so we began to study the physics of negentropy, and that is The Origin of Negentropy is the title of my book, and we can talk about that at length. But simply, when that wave goes through that center, only the perfectly symmetric, in phase, or shareable wave survives. And that is self-organizing, because only the wave that enters into that fractal symmetry survives that compression. And that's a test for pure intention.
Es muy interesante, Dan, lo que me cuentas, porque en el fondo nosotros hemos visto que muchos ponentes aquí nos hablan un poco del mundo de la geometría sagrada, y la gente lo ve desde afuera como algo muy complejo de comprender. Sin embargo, tú también has estado en la experiencia personal, ¿no? Cómo poder integrar o incorporar esa información para luego comprenderla en términos más cognitivos, ¿no? ¿Tú recomiendas eso a la gente para acercarnos a la geometría sagrada?
So it's very interesting what you're sharing. We've noticed in the summit that many of the speakers that we talk to, they talk about the world of sacred geometry, and people tend to think that sacred geometry is a very complex world. But now you've shared the fact that you can also understand sacred geometry through your personal experience. The fact that you can integrate the knowledge first in order to comprehend better and reach some sort of cognitive comprehension about sacred geometry. Do you think this is a better way to understand sacred geometry, to get close to it?
Right, it's a beautiful sentiment, because it's true. People sort of think of sacred geometry, oh, I need to study this, I need to make golden ratio, I need to learn how to draw pictures. It's all true, but it's really quite simple. As we say when we're teaching people geobiology, well, you know, make a magnetic map of your bed and your house and your city. And when you rearrange all of them to look like a rose, you're done. Because suddenly they got centripetal, they got implosive, and they got sacred and self-organizing. So, you know, sacred geometry actually ultimately is simple. When fractality, the rose-like structure, emerges, things become centripetal and organized. Now, in physics, that describes a situation called charge distribution efficiency, which is what is enabled by rose-like fractality. And charge distribution efficiency does describe the perfect city design or house design or universe design, and does describe what fractality is, and does describe what how ancestor memory travels. And so charge distribution efficiency is a good introduction to the physics of the sacred and what the rose fractal allows.
Hermoso, ¿no? Es como cuando hablas de esta eficiencia de distribución de carga, hablas también como de la verdadera democracia, por así decirlo, cósmica, ¿no? Cómo podemos redistribuir nuestras cargas en una supersimetría, por así decirlo.
So the question is how that the discovery of supersymmetry also may apply, for example, to politics or economics, that we can apply this so powerfully, a profound spiritual understanding of the physics of consciousness, to politics and economics, for example. In fact, we have a website on fractal economics. You can see it at fractalfield.com/fractal economics. And you see that the discovery of perfection, even spiritual economics, does relate to perfect distribution. In the case of perfect distribution of charge, as a metaphor for perfect distribution of material, literally how to accomplish perfect sharing. For example, my partner Valerie is very deeply into the Ananda Marga concept of Prout, P-R-O-U-T, progressive utilization theory, which is essentially spiritual economics. And it boils down in many ways to simply learning the highest and best way to share everything. And in fact, what we're talking about here is the perfectly shareable wave, which becomes the perfect distribution of goods in economics. So when you study fractal economics, for example, you're learning how distribution structures literally mechanically look like roses as well. And then the hierarchy in the organization of the administration of a business begins to look like a rose instead of a hierarchy. And then one final thought about the politics. You know, what would fractal or spiritual politics look like? And we've talked about this many times, that the term body polis, as it describes when a beehive can swarm, the origin of the word politic refers to the fact that the beehive collectively makes a plasma charge field, literally of bliss. And the collective charge field of bliss, the result of getting fractal and implosive, is then navigable. So the beehive knows when to swarm, literally when there is enough collective bliss. And that collective biologic navigation function, body polis, the ability to collectively have bliss together, makes the collective mind navigable, steerable. Literally the biologic definition of politics, the ability to have collective bliss.
Maravilloso. Maravilloso. Es muy importante. Hemos visto cómo charla tras charla o ponencia tras ponencia, cada uno de los invitados acá nos están haciendo entender que el estudio de todas estas materias, en el fondo, es el estudio de un conocimiento unificado que necesitamos integrar para poder aplicarlo a todas las áreas de lo humano, ¿no? Y me encanta la imagen que nos pones en nuestros corazones y en nuestra mente, Dan, que es la imagen de la rosa gozosa, ¿no? El blaze rose, ¿no? Y como aquí en nuestro corazón, porque ahí podemos entender un poco más lo que tú hablas como la implosión. ¿Qué sería la implosión y su mecánica? ¿Cuál es su mecánica, Dan, en ese sentido?
This is very, very beautiful and important to realize that what we've seen throughout this summit, pretty much every person that we talk to, every speaker, they all talk about the fact that what you're helping us understand is that sacred geometry is somehow the study of a unified knowledge that we can apply into our lives, in all areas of human existence. And I very much love this image that you put in our hearts, this idea of a blissful rose. But well, what I wanted to ask was, how can this knowledge help us understand this idea of implosion, and what is implosion, and what is the mechanics of implosion?
So I think in your question, the best metaphor to start with might be the heart. What is implosion in the heart, and how does that teach us about love or empathy or compassion, for example? We could start with that electrical metaphor. It is medically proven that the healthy heart is a fractal heart. In medicine, that's called harmonic inclusiveness. And harmonic inclusiveness, defining immune health by measurement in heart rate variability, we know is defined by the perfection of harmonic inclusiveness is the problem that golden ratio fractality solves. Another way to look at that question in terms of the onset of compassion and love in the heart is to think about answering your 4-year-old's question when she says, Daddy, where does my heartbeat come from? And there are physicists who've spent a lifetime on that question, actually. Yeah. And there's a place in the heart called fibers of Purkinje, which are famously a nerve fractal shaped like a perfect tree. And so literally a perfect electrical tree implodes charge, and that's the origin electrically of your heartbeat. And if you map how that propagates electrically around the heart, it's literally an infinite fractal nest of donut inside donut. This originally was called When Time Breaks Down, the Origin of Cardiac Arrhythmia by Arthur T. Winfrey, a famous technical book. Point being, what we discovered by measurement was that ability to include as many harmonics in your heart, medically proven to define immune health, also coincidentally defines compassion. Why would inclusiveness, which is literally fractal in the heart, also electrically define compassion, harmonic inclusiveness? And that reason, how many frequencies can you invite in your heart, is identical psychologically with how many people you can invite into your heart.
Wow.
So it's more than symbolic, you see. It's literally about turning inside out recursively, starts an implosion phenomena that's medically known to be the quote unquote fractal heart. And it is like a rose inside a rose. It is centripetal, it is implosiveness, and yes, it does steer tornadoes.
Me das la sensación y la imagen de abrazar el universo, ¿no? Eso sería como la implosión.
You give me the sensation and the feeling of hugging the universe.
Yeah.
That's what implosion could be about.
Yes, functionally, we know the arrangement of masses in the universe is dodecahedral golden ratio, just like the Earth grid and DNA and every living protein. And there's a reason for that fractality, which is because that doesn't just define stable gravity, it defines a universe that's moving toward negentropy, literally mindfulness. And that means mindfulness means having a centripetal center, getting fractal, as it were. And so people who say, you need to be in love with the universal intelligence, the divine mind, what they're saying is, you need to be able to withstand the charge at the center of that fractal, which gets intensely more like lightning as your bliss becomes more intense. So that means that as you get more and more centered in your bliss and the lightning gets more dense, more mind is coming through you, but it also means there is a test that you must think only shareable thoughts, pure intention, or that lightning will burn you. A very practical example of that story, I don't know if you were there in Assisi, but in Assisi, they're very proud of telling the famous story about St. Francis, that when he walked down from the little town into the woods, to have his little prayer and bliss experience, the plasma that radiated from a distance was so bright that they called the fire department. It's a true story.
Hermoso, nos pones a Francisco aquí. Y en ese sentido, el concepto de gravedad, que a mí me interesa mucho, tu concepto de gravedad definiría, estaría muy cercano a lo que me estás contando, ¿no es cierto? ¿Qué es la gravedad desde la visión de la geometría sagrada, Dan?
Very beautiful that you bring St. Francis into this conversation. Thanks for that. And the concept of gravity, I'm very much interested in what you think about this concept, how you understand it. And is this what you're telling us somehow close or related to the concept of gravity? And what is gravity, and how can we understand it from the perspective of sacred geometry?
And we do say that, unlike most physicists, to understand spirituality, you do need to know why an object falls to the ground, something your physics teacher doesn't apparently know. And gravity as a word can be dissected pretty simply. The G ray of vita, the G ray of life. So what is a G ray? A G is where the circle meets a line perfectly, which is literally, obviously, spiral implosion. So the cause of gravity lies in the fact, for example, that I newly proved that the radii of hydrogen are golden ratio times Planck. Planck length and time is a musical key signature of the universe. So if you multiply by exponents powers of golden ratio, you get hydrogen radii and all of the important wavelengths that cause negentropy. You can see our physics review at fractalfield.com, and we have all the physics worked out. So back to the question of gravity. So what gravity is the charge implosion, where those waves on the golden ratio spiral G ray of vita are adding and multiplying recursively, not just their wavelength, but their phase velocity. And as the phase velocity of those waves adds and multiplies recursively, constructively, that turns compression of charge into acceleration of charge toward the center. The phase velocity is adding and multiplying recursively, constructively. And the name for that acceleration of charge toward center caused by fractality in physics is called the gravity. So the fact that charge experiences acceleration towards center in the geometry of golden ratio fractality is the reason gravity exists. We proved that not just in the case of hydrogen, but in general, we've now proven. You see, most physicists already believe that fractality causes gravity. They simply didn't know how. And we answered that question by equation. You can read all of the physics equations and our publications in the physics literature at fractalfield.com/vacuum energy, the equations of publications. Point being very simply that hydrogen's core itself is a rose-like fractal based on golden ratio. That's why it's negentropic, and how it makes gravity. So that brings up the question of the spiritual psychology of gravity, because any shaman will tell you if you follow the feeling of gravity through your feet to the heart of the earth, to the heart of the sun, and you track that with your attention, suddenly your mind will enter the heart of the earth and the heart of the sun. So that's called paying your debt to gravity, and reveals a much deeper truth here, which is literally how you float, how you make gravity, how, for example, Buckminster fullerene carbon nano makes gravity, and the solution to propulsion, which on this planet is sadly primitive, because we know now forms of propulsion and energy that make this planet look like the Stone Ages. And it's simply a matter, for example, knowing why carbon assembles into a fractal, golden ratios. Fractal, it's a dodecastellation. We have a Star Mother kit to build that, goldenmean.info/kit. So we know how gravity is made. We know how why objects fall off the ground, and we know the relationship of stabilizing gravity to stabilizing consciousness. I'll just leave you with one final little thought, as we've mentioned many times, but it had been measured 11 different times when more than 1 million children sang the same song together. There was a dramatic reduction in the solar flares. This is measurable. As it's measurable that focused attention causes charge to compress or implode, collective focused attention affects the gravity of the sun. And we know that every ancient religion was a sun god religion. And we know that the sun makes people because the sun needs something from us. And that is a centripetal force, a gravity that is stabilized by mindfulness. Literally what steers.
Yo, Dan, te iba a hacer una pregunta sobre cuáles son los cambios tecnológicos y científicos de conocer estos conceptos, ¿no? ¿Qué podrían traer en nuestra sociedad? Pero tengo que agregar que hay un cambio, ¿cuáles serían los cambios no solo tecnológicos ni científicos, sino que espirituales también? En nuestra, entiéndase espiritual, mi conexión con el universo, ¿no? ¿Cuáles tú crees que podrían ser estos cambios para nuestra sociedad humana? ¿Por qué son tan necesarios?
So I was going to originally make a question about what technological or scientific advancements or changes you think this concept will bring to our society, but I now must include also the concept of spirituality. What technological, scientific, and spiritual changes do you think this concept or this understanding will bring to us?
Well, you know, in terms of the physics there, I mentioned an introduction to our carbon nanotechnology group, and we've made dramatic progress there. We know that carbon, when it grows naturally, looks like a dodecastellation called fullerene, and it's negentropic. And the implications for energy and propulsion revolutionize almost everything on this planet, not just 32 times stronger than steel. It's much more important. But the spiritual meaning of this, I think, is illustrated by the following as an interesting example. If you look at the children that we're working with who are learning to see without their eyes, we're teaching them in their brainwaves to make the same frequency signature in the brainwaves that causes Schumann harmonics and causes stable gravity, that alpha beta golden ratio cascade in the brainwaves, which is the perfect trance. And children who relax enough to feel that bliss, when they close their eyes, they see literally a vortex tunnel appear inside their head, and they describe looking through a tunnel, and they can see. And you'll see all the films of our work with this at flameinmind.com/outervision. And the point is, not only do we know that plasma vortex, which is literally an eyeball inside a tornado, not only is that the physics of vision, but it's the only real physics of consciousness that ever explained how you can take your vision outside your head, as thousands of surgeons have documented in near-death experiences and astral projection, remote viewing. So, and we also know that focused attention causes charge to compress, and now we know why. So learning what the real physics of consciousness is, which is a charged tornado that starts inside your head, but that can propagate outside your head under certain electrical conditions, which are teachable. It teaches you, for example, literally the electrical path through death, how you measure ghosts, and how you can actually teach remote viewing and healing at a distance. And astral projection, the real physics of Sheman, is the ability to project a plasma vortex. For example, works better at sunrise and sunset for the 4 directions because of phase conjugation. It works better if sender and receiver are at a longitudinal node called sacred space. We know the physics of that action at a distance. We know the physics of the best place for birth and death and shamanic remote viewing and sacred space, all based on this simple understanding that at that moment of implosive charge compression that creates vision, the center of your bliss, that propagation of that array predicts where you can make phone calls to ancestors, where ancestral memory in the collective unconscious, that radio is available at the longitudinal fractal nodes, formerly called sacred space. And all of that's measurable. So the implications here are huge and beautiful.
Maravilloso, porque Estamos hablando ya de cómo la geometría sagrada, cómo toda esta información puede generar finalmente la expansión del potencial humano, ¿no? Y salirnos de este lugar de humildad o de pequeñez para entrar a la grandeza de lo que estamos reflejando también. ¿Tú crees que esto lo sabían los ancestros, los antiguos? Porque yo veo mucho tu trabajo, Dan, que tú compones tu información desde la visión ancestral más la visión vanguardista, ¿no? Haces esta unificación. ¿Cuál es la importancia de unir las visiones del pasado y las del presente vanguardista, por así decirlo?
This is beautiful because now what you're talking about is how sacred geometry and this information can allow us to expand our human potential and forget about this humbleness or this feeling of being so little and to enter into the greatness of human potential. Do you think that our ancestors knew this? Because I look at your work very much and I see how you integrate this ancient understanding of these concepts and also the more modern understanding. So what is important of bringing both the ancient and modern views around sacred geometry together from your point of view?
Well, in terms of the ancient wisdom, let's take the example of those who knew where the pyramids should be placed. Obviously, we're told from our extraterrestrial sources, including Pleiadian and Galactic Federation, that the pyramid array, which we now know is on a nodal array, which is fractal dodecaecosa, that pyramid array used the implosive infrasound piezoelectric of those pyramids to implode what's called the transverse EMF into a longitudinal array, a compressional electromagnetic array, which is more distributable. And that distributed that charge correctly around the world, literally a global wireless power grid, which was totally functional and effective. Tesla attempted that, but he didn't understand the fractality or phase conjugation to get either the frequencies or the nodes correct. But we now know, for example, the ancients absolutely understood how to have a global wireless power grid that was very efficient based on that physics. It turns out that those same longitudinal nodes, the sacred sites, the dodecaecosa birth grid, also predicts where radioactive nuclear critical mass is reduced, as Bruce Cathy measured. It predicts the only real place you can have cathedral, labyrinth, Kozyrev mirror, sacred space. It's all at these longitudinal compressional nodes, because that's where the compression wave, longitudinal wave, sometimes called scalar, bounces in and out of the vortex that then makes it available locally as transverse. That physics of all action at a distance and heat containment at a distance, literally how to light a flame with your mind at a distance. So that fractal array physics was clearly well known by the ancients. Now, we know something else here, which is that the extraterrestrials, we have been in communication with many. We admire, for example, the Andromedans. They have informed us something similar, that for thousands of years, extraterrestrials who have been coming here, shepherding the evolution of our DNA in part, have been seeking those humans who could lucid dream and therefore take memory through death. And the ancients knew that. Even the story of Noah predicting when the flood was happening, because the test for Noah's communication that told him when the flood was happening was literally through the screen of the physics of what is a lucid dream, which is that same longitudinal bubble propagating from your aura, the physics of what it is to have a soul, the Ka from the Ba, the Kesjan body, the rainbow light body, many names for that. So the ancients understood that also. So our planet has been a fertile, rose-like breeding ground tended carefully by the ancients and the ETs to produce the possibility that our children could have a soul that has reached that immortal sustainable field effect, which I call longitudinal interferometry, that fractal grid penetration which is the geometry of DNA radio, collective unconscious, Akashic records, communion of saints. So obviously the ancestors knew all of these things. In fact, any Aboriginal would tell you that the definition of value of your day is whether you communicated with ancestors. And where they went to make ancestor phone calls, Karatkov measured the fractality of the air and proved that fractal air defines ancestor memory access. So all of this has to do with the fact that this knowledge has been around us for as long as not just this planet existed, but as long as the evolution of DNA radio existed, which is, when we say, well, millions of people felt it the moment some great tragedy happens and many people die on the planet, everyone feels it suddenly. Well, now we know the physics of that DNA radio, and it's not limited to this planet.
Y en ese sentido, Dan, en estos momentos donde hay tanta tribulación y cambio, y estamos sintiendo en el campo esta perturbación, ¿no? Y ¿crees tú que es clave en estos momentos comprender, entender y incorporar esta información? ¿Tú ves esperanza en este conocimiento y su aplicación?
And from that point of view, Dan, this particular time, human history, we're feeling in our field so much change, so much turmoil. We're also seeing it outside, right? And why do you think it's important in this particular time of much change and turmoil to access this knowledge, to start integrating it? And do you see there's hope for us through this better understanding of sacred geometry and all the knowledge that we talked about?
Well, obviously, there are, every time is the best of times and the worst of times. And this is clearly probably the worst of the best of the times, the best of the worst. But that it's clear that our ability to have an immune system and to have bliss is increasingly challenged. And so our task is, in fact, to teach governments and universities the physics of why, if you don't have a bliss bubble or cocoon, not only will you not have an immune system, but you won't have what DNA requires to reach immortality, and you won't have what the ETs need by coming here. In other words, if you can educate and produce and grow and blossom a child that's able to have bliss and lucid dreaming, literally a psychokinetic child, as the times get more and more difficult, you have tremendous leverage. Because see, again, our studies include lots of extraterrestrial contacts. And every single one of those ET groups, the good ones and the bad ones, especially the Greys and the Dracos and the Pleiadians, you know what they all come here for or looking for? They're looking for DNA that has a soul. Where are the kids who can lucid dream? We need them. They're the ones who still had some bliss, still had that longitudinal coherence cocoon around their body. And that's what's of value here. And guess what's precisely most threatened today? A child who can still have bliss. That means a child who can deep breathe and feel safe and have charged living food. All the exact things that are being prevented by the global wave of fear and vaccination and all those things. I'm not saying vaccinations are evil, but I'm saying there are certain circumstances where if you know you have a good immune system, you make that immune system with your own bliss practice and your hygiene. And that is the ultimate way to build that cocoon. And you may not have to squirt something into your arm to create immune health, if you understand the physics of immune health, which is implosion in the aura. So yes, the fact that we're more and more challenged by being able to have bliss by all the facts that our governments and our doctors do not know that bliss is important. They don't even know that bliss exists. And yet, in fact, that charged radiance is the only way to get an immune system and get immortal and get anything that survives ET parasites. It all comes down to, do you have bliss? Actually, charged radiance. So obviously, once we reset our priorities on creating the ability to have a blissful child, the only real definition of culture, can you teach your child how to have bliss? So our task is to teach governments and universities the importance of the physics of bliss, and in that respect, reinvent the purpose of culture. Yes.
¿Y qué mensaje final podrías darle a la gente que nos está viendo, Dan? ¿Cómo puedo cultivar este gozo, este bliss en nuestro, y cómo puedo generar este campo de gozo con las herramientas que tengo a mano en este momento?
So, what would your final message be for people that are listening to us now? How can we cultivate this bliss and generate this bliss field using the tools that we have available for us now?
Well, on a technological level, our flameinmind.com is some incredibly powerful brainwave biofeedback software, and the binaural bliss audio component, the Flame in Sound, which is part of flameinmind.com, is amazing. And this is, I'm not saying everyone needs it, but it is a beautifully powerful tool. And we know how to make bliss in water, theimploder.com. We have applied this technology to creating literally blissful water, which is super soluble water, charge implosion water. And we have created bliss in charge in plasma, therify.net. 30% of people who get up out of therify.net plasma system, and there's a beautiful center in Santiago, actually, they report some bliss experience, and also 30% report some sharpening of vision. So these are examples. I'm not saying everyone needs, but they're powerful examples of proof of concept, and they've been amazingly successful. Obviously, the more general answer, which is, hygiene for bliss, which means diet, breath exercise, the yoga, and the astral hygiene and the psychological hygiene, for example, learning how to spend every day thinking only shareable thoughts, which means every experience, especially stressful experiences, ultimately distills to a pure principle. If the pure principle, which is educational and serves all of humanity, is understood, because that's what DNA is in the business of, distilling pure principle. That's why that's the only thing that actually gets through the compression called death is actually a survival memory that's of use to everyone. A pure shareable wave. You can't die successfully if you're angry, because you can't be compressed, because that wave is not shareable. So when you learn to distill every experience into pure principle, which is that exercise of visualizing your day like it's a movie, and if you can play the movie backwards without interrupting yourself, suddenly you've digested your day and it's ready for compression, which is called the non-destructive collapse process. It's both physics and metaphysics. And so yes, the very practical hygiene for bliss experience. And by the way, we tried to assemble those hygienes in one of my early books called Implosion, Secret Science of Ecstasy and Immortality, Conscious Kids. goldenmean.info/conscious kids attempted to be a review of the hygiene for bliss practice, which is basically learning how to attract charge. For example, every one you choose to hug and everything you choose to eat is ultimately selected on the basis of whether in fact that will help you implode charge.
Qué simple, qué complejo, qué vasto, qué maravilloso. Te quiero agradecer de todo corazón, Dan, no solo el participar en esta cumbre, sino que también te quiero honrar. Yo te conozco hace muchos años y honro el trabajo que estás haciendo en esta tierra y honro la posibilidad de, como dices tú, distribuir este agradecimiento y este gozo de estar vivos. Muchísimas gracias, Dan, por todo esto.
Oh, how simple. how complete and complex and vast and beautiful. And Dan, I want to thank you from the heart so much, not only for participating in the summit, but also I want to honor you. I've known you for a few years now. I've followed you for many years now, and I've seen that the work that you do in this earth is beautiful, and I want to honor you for that. This concept that you use of distributing our reads and our acknowledgement of the work that you do. Basically, thank you for this concept of bliss brought into our lives.
Well, thank you. I too am honored. And, you know, the smiles I saw across South America were some of the best ones on the planet, the love and the heart space. And I'm really grateful to reconnect with our friends over there. And we are at your service anytime. Call us anytime we can help each other. info@fractalfield.com, and let's stay in touch. I send immense love and blessings to all who are with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hemos llegado al final de esta conversación. Fue un agrado para mí y estoy seguro que para todas las personas que están participando en esta cumbre también fue maravilloso escucharte hablar sobre estos temas tan interesantes. Recuerden dejar sus comentarios en la plataforma y en las redes sociales. Me puedes encontrar en Instagram como @jpuribebiogeometría y nos vemos en otro encuentro en la cumbre.